Hello, world, and welcome to the Elm Podcast. I'm your host, TJ, and thanks for rocking out with us today. So, this podcast is a free space. Do what comes naturally to you. We know what makes us us is our personal experiences. And when we grow and share those experiences, that's truly our gift. So, pull up a seat. Let's get ready to rock. Hello, people. We are still deep into our series on racial profiling and policy pre and post 9/11, written in 2002. We are now going to get into some audio right after 9/11 happened. President Bush was unable to predict the events of September 11, 2001. It is debatable whether experts had foreseen that terrorism would reach the American mainland, but nevertheless, it happened during Bush's administration. What followed this tragedy included a stalling on Bush's racial discrimination initiative, a policy tactic of using popular sentiment to obtain policy changes, and a change in the main targets of racial discrimination. This event invalidated the president's contention that actively pursuing a ban on racial discrimination was going to be the cornerstone of his term in office. White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, in a press release concerning statements made by the president on racial equality issues, says, in the president's address to Congress last year, upon taking office, the president called for a ban on racial profiling. As a result of the war that began on September 11th, has gotten distracted to other issues, of course. This is indicative of the state of racial profiling in this post-9/11 era. The state of flux can partially be attributed to Congress and policymaking. The current state of deadlock between Republicans and Democrats in Congress played a very important role in the policymaking since September 11th. Since the Republican Party was in control of the White House and almost even with the Democrats in Congress, they needed some way to propagate their agendas. Walter Lefebvre writes, September 11 did mark something new, in part because of the extent of the horror, in part because so many lives were brutally taken on U.S. soil, and in part because Americans formed a consensus in back of the president. Such a consensus was not always apparent earlier in the American century when the nation's interests came under attack. The strength of the consensus was surprising because the Bush administration warned that this could be a war lasting many decades, with objectives necessarily changing in a complex, highly unpredictable global world. The way Republicans gained this massive consensus was through sentiment politics. Playing on the popular sentiment of the time is a strategy that dates back to the Revolutionary era in America. The Federalist paper, number 6, Alexander Hamilton writes, has it not, on the contrary, invariably been found that momentary passions and immediate interests have more active and imperious control over human conduct than general or remote considerations of policy, utility, or justice? Is it not well known that their determinations are often governed by a few individuals in whom they place confidence and are, of course, liable to be tinctured by the passions and views of those individuals? The Republicans in Congress use this strategy, which is only effective for a limited time period after the occurrence of a tragedy. The people of the United States after September 11 were deeply concerned with the security of their interests, both domestically and abroad. However, the lack of knowledge concerning the intricacies of politics was very similar to the colonists in the late 1700s. During the months immediately following September 11, Congress was able to pass legislation that would not have been accepted in a non-wartime era. However, the security concerns of constituents prompted congressmen to vote in favor of legislation, despite its controversy level. This legislation included the Terrorist Bombing Convention Implementation Act of 2001, the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, and the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act of 2002. The Terrorist Bombing Convention Implementation Act of 2001, in essence, imposed binding legal obligations upon state parties either to submit for prosecution or to extradite any person within their jurisdiction who unlawfully and intentionally delivers, places, discharges, or detonates an explosive or other lethal device in, into, or against a place of public use, a state or government facility, a public transportation system, or an infrastructure facility. A state party is subject to these obligations without regard to the place where the alleged act covered by the convention took place. The Aviation and Transportation Security Act gave the federal government immediate and comprehensive control of aviation security. A new transportation security agency, housed at the Department of Transportation, was created to hire federal employees to supervise, manage, and to train all passenger and baggage screeners. The new security agency also established and enforced new qualification standard for screeners, performing background checks on all screeners and other persons with access to secure areas at airports, and provided a uniform federal law enforcement present at commercial airports. The Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act of 2002 strengthened the ability of the U.S. government to control the country's borders, a top priority of the Bush administration. The act improved the ability to screen aliens seeking to enter the country, facilitated the sharing of border-related information among U.S. agencies, and improved efforts to keep track of foreign students and foreign exchange visitors in the United States. The administration had considerable success passing these bills, but not all legislation was passed in both houses of Congress. When legislation led by the Republicans did not pass, such as the original economic stimulus bill, the GOP immediately accused Democratic members of Congress of being insensitive to Homeland Security, propagating the spread of terrorism, and, ironically, playing party politics. This strategy of playing on the nation's popular sentiment proved just as effective for Republicans after September 11th as it was in securing the ratification of the Constitution for the Federalists in the 1790s. What resulted included a slew of racially biased bills and laws, along with a pro-American ideology that targeted foreigners and especially persons believed to be of Arab descent. What subsequently followed was a polarization of the country in a way that never occurred previously. Americans were either so upset that people from the Middle Eastern countries perpetrated such carnage, or so shocked by the realization that massive terrorism had reached the isolation area of North America that revenge and reprisals took precedent over understanding and learning how a vulnerable system was exploited. The quest for revenge for the tragedy of September 11 switched the discriminated groups from American minorities to foreign-born people in the United States. Terrorism had seemingly been reapportioned to stand for anyone of Muslim or Arabic descent. This claim is substantiated by scholarly work, measures taken by the government, and actions of American citizens. Oddly enough, in logical terms, but understandable in terms of the American mindset of history, African Americans, the former target group of the racial discrimination, had issues deciding on what side to stand when concerning the new age of terrorism. Brian Gilmore in The Progressive writes, "Why wasn't I deeply depressed? This was a tragedy of epic proportions. The loss of human life was unfathomable. Osama bin Laden issued a fatwa years ago, and he said all Americans should be killed. Not white Americans, but all Americans. That meant me and my wife and my daughter and the rest of my family and Americans of every race and ethnicity." Mr. Gilmore points out that on one side of the debate, raging inside of African Americans in the United States, the lack of identity afforded to African Americans led to a feeling of uncertainty, whether to side with America or to retroactively reflect on past relations. Tavis Smiley, an authority on African American issues in America, says, "We understand what it means to be disenfranchised, to be terrorized, to be disavowed. We've been victims of torture and lynchings right here in America. I don't necessarily sense that black folk feel any resentment, but I do feel rather strongly that most African Americans have been saying to America at large that we've been enduring this for years and we've got some perspective on this." The debate on whether to accept the new governmental initiatives and the feelings of the nation has also presented itself in the black community. For example, M. Shaw Copeland writes, "Recall the newspaper articles that crowed the reaction of an African American man who was questioned about the acceptability of racial profiling of Arab Americans. The man states he was not quite sure just how he felt. He admitted to experiences of being racially profiled, but perhaps, he wondered, this situation might be different. Then the man admitted his shame at the attempt to justify racial profiling in this instance." This is an example on how war changes perspectives, as well as how the sentiment towards racial profiling has been skewed by the events of September 11. 2 years prior to September 11, when racial profiling was seemingly on its way out of the door, you would not expect to hear an African American condoning the practice of racial discrimination. However, the statement is not the problem, but rather a struggle between being patriotic and being nationalistic. Again, quoting Tavis Smiley, he says about the effects that September 11 had on the black community, "I think we quickly found ourselves being whipped up into this flag fever. I found it disturbing that people were not making a critical distinction between what patriotism is and what nationalism is. Patriotism clearly allows you to critique your country. You can love your country and criticize it and still be a patriot. Nationalism, quite frankly, is fanaticism. It is unfettered, uncritical thinking, just going along with the masses. That distinction, I thought, needed to be made between patriotism and nationalism. The problem is that to make those kind of distinctions gets you labeled unpatriotic." This quote is indicative of not only the state of African Americans since September 11th, but of all Americans. What is the deciding factor that separates patriotism from nationalism? That is a question that always answers itself with time, but only with retrospection, and arguably by then it's too late. However, Americans seem to place less importance on the events of the past when a current issue is threatening the security of its interests. This was the case in the 1880s when Chinese people were prohibited from entering the U.S. and forced to leave, and in the 1940s when people of Japanese ancestry were relocated to internment camps during World War II, even though most had the strongest convictions for Western and United States-based ideologies. The problem remains consistent, even though the target group and the issues vary over time. As history indicates, this is a problem that is inherently American, yet popular sentiment and the current issues continue to evolve without applicable opposition. The changing scope of racial profiling, from its evolution to its apex, to its decline, and ultimately its reemergence since September 11, proposes the question, why has racial profiling been reinstated systematically in post-9/11 America? After taking a thorough inventory of historical and emerging scholarship, I submit that racial profiling has resurfaced in America because a consensus to reinstate a no profiling policy has not been pushed for as stringently as in the past or by enough important actors since September 11th. I'm going to end it here. Somehow, 20 years later, September 11th, 2021, America still struggles or has found itself back into a place where it still struggles to differentiate nationalism from patriotism. Tell me what you think.